And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're gathering on today, who are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. And I welcome everyone here for the third of our art and design research forums. And the way we run these research forums is we invite guests to curate a series of talks by invited panelists, largely from within the school, but we like to extend that reach to broaden the debate of our research to others from within UNSW and beyond. For this seminar, we've got Eduardo Sandoval, and he is one of our leading creative robotics lab researchers. And you're a Science Year Fellow still at the moment, aren't you? Yeah. And I'm just going to hand straight over to Eduardo to take it from here and chair. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Lolly. Wow. Thank you so much for the applause. I didn't expect that. And thank you so much for attending. It's the first forum in this year that is face-to-face. So I'm very glad that you show up. And also, you can see me using a jacket. Very often, you will not see me using a jacket. It's my special jacket for academic events. And today, we have this very interesting topic, multidisciplinary ethical design of interactive technologies, avoiding manipulation, biases, and prejudice. And it's a title long enough. I want to add that I want to put extra words, and I want to say that it's beyond regular interactive technologies, because all the researchers we have here today work in cutting-edge topics. So essentially, the goal is, discuss this multidisciplinary approach that is really uncommon when we develop interactive technologies. So all the research that will be present today will discuss examples, possibilities, and of course, challenges and dilemmas. We have a couple of expert attendees also in these topics, coming from UNSW Canberra and a UNSW main campus, that I'm very sure with this combination, we will have a very interesting discussion at the end of the event. And this is the agenda for today. I changed it a little bit because technical issues, so forget about the pizza at 1:45. The pizza's already there. So if you want a slide, just go and grab yourself, and don't wait until it's cold. We will still be here. But essentially, every of our presenters will be presenting for 15 minutes, very, very short presentation about their own work. So you can see, the particulars of that research. And then we will discuss for maybe 30 minutes about, the challenges that we are facing. I guess it's a topic of interest of everybody here, new practitioners and, current academics and so on. And a question and answer session. So just going to the topic, we have Nicole Robinson from Monash University, sister city of research, also CEO of Lyrio Robotics. We have Sarita Hers, our postdoc in the Creative Robotics Lab. Haider Akmal, also academic here in the Art and Design School. Also, you lead one of the lab postgraduate path projects, and Scott Brown recently named director of the sector engagement health, if I'm not wrong. Wonderful. And me, of course. All of them early career academics that I respect and admire, and I have the fortune to know since a couple of years ago. So I'm very happy that we can discuss this topic among them. Just brief introductions of all of them. You can know why they are here. Nicole Robinson is a fellow research fellow at Monash University. She has a lot of work to do because she has a cross appointment among different faculties. So every time I talk with her, she's busy. And she's also a joint lecturer in Queensland University of Technology, which is where I know you since you were a lecturer there. And she has built up an interdisciplinary research group that specializes across both scientific methods and novel engineering. And super interesting approach about this type of research. And she, like me, works in human-robot interaction, and that's why we talk very often about this thing. Also, we have Sarita Hers. She's an accomplished interdisciplinary researcher specializing in the intricate relationship between humans and technology, with a background in psychology and a PhD focus in trust calibration in human-agent collaboration, critical topic in what we are discussing today. And well, you can read everything here, but essentially, a particular point that is interesting in the bio of Sarita is that she's passionate about translating research findings into practical solutions that enhance the usability of technological systems, which is super interesting and challenging, and something that we will discuss as well. Then we have a very good friend as well, crossing the corridor. His office is there, knocking the door very often, and helping to procrastinate. Haider Akmal. He's a speculative design researcher, future focus, service designer, practicing printmaker at UNSW Art Design and Architecture. And it's very fun to talk to you, because very interesting, because we are always talking about the playful, speculative approaches towards design solutions imagined through innovative and unconventional applications of technology. Of course, we talk about these things with easier words, but it's always interesting to discuss these topics from the theoretical perspective. And he's originally from Pakistan. He's alumnus of the National College of Arts in Lahore, as well as Lancaster University. And his work has been exhibited internationally with prints in collections in the China Print Museum, Singapore, London, and across Pakistan. But he has a heavy focus in the theoretical aspects of what we are discussing today. Also, we have Scott Brown, I guess the second person that I met when I joined UNSW, and the person that I ping more often in Teams, so hopefully I don't annoy him enough. But yeah, he's lecturer at UNSW Arts and Design and Architecture, using interactive technologies and human-centered design approaches to work with neurodiverse populations. And also brings UX and media arts perspective to inclusive design and assistive technology, and his teaching and research practices examine creative implementations of embodiment and sensory interaction and the value of accessible technology in eliciting social engagement. So I guess we will start with Sarita, if you don't mind. So you can present in 15 minutes. Let me give you the stage. And let me find your presentation somewhere here. You can have the microphone. So.
I might just pop it back in.
Here.
So I made a title page, but you guys all know what you're here for. This is the ethical design of interactive technologies. Thanks for the lovely introduction. So I kind of kept my presentation in and of itself quite short. I thought the value in us all getting together was more in terms of panel discussion and getting questions from you guys. But in order to facilitate that, I thought I'd give you a bit of insight around my background as an academic, as a researcher in this area. So as Eduardo said, I have a background in psychology. My undergrad was in psychology. I did honors there. Then I went on to do a bit of research in cognitive neuroscience. After that, I moved into a PhD that was in trust calibration to improve human-agent collaboration. That was in an engineering faculty in computer science. I started my PhD there and ended it in a business school at UNSW. So I've moved around to a lot of faculties. I'm now a postdoc in this current faculty. So some might say she's transdisciplinary. It's what's required in this new age of technology and human interaction, really. I've kind of thrown down some industry partners that I've worked with. Alongside doing my PhD, I did a lot of industry projects. Turns out that I was doing unpaid work, but you don't know that as a PhD student. So I worked on a project with CBA and Air New Zealand that was putting a social robot into the Sydney airport, into the international terminal, which had its own problems, but a really insightful project. I've also worked with Southwest Sydney Local Health District. We developed, designed, and put a social robot into Fairfield Hospital. It was a great project. I really liked it, but unfortunately, through the assessment stage of the project, the tail end ended up overlapping with the start of COVID. So that project wrapped itself up quite quickly, as all research does. And then the Sydney Startup Hub, we again were working with social robots in that context. That project in particular was kind of around privacy, data privacy as well. My current role, so I work as a postdoc here. in the creative robotics lab, but also I do a bit of work in the National Facility of Human-Robot Interaction, and some current industry partners that I work with there are the DSTG, so that's Defence Science Technology Group, and the Army. And then I'm working with Scott on a project with West Tigers. And then I'm also still working with a business school at UNSW, and for that project I'm working with Roche, and that's with a digital diagnosis technology. Really cool stuff, really foundational work. A lot of my research across the board has been quite foundational because it's innovative technology. So ethics across research. I'm going to move that out. Okay. When I was thinking about ethics here, I was a bit confused as to what direction to go, what you guys actually wanted to hear about when we talked about ethics. So I kind of threw down 3 topics, I think. The first one was experimental ethics in a university context. What is the point of doing an ethics application in this world, in transdisciplinary work, in innovation, in technology? Well, the first, and this is classic with any ethics application, is that the point of whatever experiment or study that you're doing is justified in terms of the balance of harm, effort, and insight. More often than not with new technology or new systems, that type of testing is very low priority. It's rare, I think, to be able to develop something that leads to a very severe ethics application. What I've found is normally that ends up being in clinical trials if you're doing something in medicine or something like that. So a lot of my work has been kind of low ethics priority, which has its own positives and benefits. As a researcher and workload-wise, it's great to be able to do a low priority ethics application, or a low risk ethics application, I should say. But I wanted to underscore the idea that this is the ethics of the study itself. It's not the ethics of the idea. So when we're doing a study, when we're doing an experiment, you're putting forward something to test. You have hypothesis, you have a background. An ethics panel generally is assessing that in terms of how is it going to potentially harm the participant involved. It's, in my personal opinion, very rare for an ethics panel to be able to have the domain knowledge to understand the potential additional impacts of that idea on society. And I feel like maybe that's what we're here for, the wider scope idea of what is ethics in this research. I also wanted to kind of touch on the idea of ethics in industry and really hone in on the idea that it depends on your industry partner. Some are extremely rigorous. I've found that often in industry, it's industry paired with government that have quite rigorous ethics applications. There are some places in industry that don't even consider ethics at all. What is ethics? I've found that in those types of industry projects, coming in as more of a UX researcher or someone with human behavioral knowledge, domain expertise, there's an implied understanding or thought that my expertise involves ethics. So in the decision making that I'm doing in that study itself, I'm bringing ethical knowledge and implementation within it. Whether or not that's a good thing, it means that it's just self-regulated. Again, this is an industry kind of thing. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it currently is the way it is. This kind of brought me into the idea of what are some current concerns of technology research. These are just a few things that sprung to mind, but obviously come into, classic your real world. So we have privacy and transparency, misinformation, which is again a huge area, and then the moral use of data and personal information. I was sitting and thinking about, what is the point of this all? Where could we go with this? And I hope that this will lead to some questions, maybe discussion in the panel, but the idea of regulation, I think that's the thing that pops up most often. People are like, okay, well, there's all of this technology, there's all of this data, we need regulation. Regulation is not keeping up with the rate of change, the rate of innovation. But what is the current regulation here. I mean, you have regulation within industry itself. Privacy policies are changing all the time, and more often than not, users don't have any input or insight into this. Whether or not privacy policies are actually upheld, I can list a number of technologies or technology businesses that are doing illegal things with the data that they're collecting and are collecting data in illegal ways. But it's behind closed doors, so it doesn't actually matter what policy they're putting forward to the public. They're doing something different. I also wanted to flag the idea that we have Australia's AI ethical design principles, or principles themselves. They were released a couple of years ago now, but they're principles. It's a suggestion on how to act. It's not necessarily a regulation that you have to adhere to. There's also the EU, if you've been following this all. They have put forward the AI Act, and that is an enforceable regulation. It's currently being placed through their parliamentary process with the intention of, I think, it coming into play by the end of this year if things go well. But again, what is the point of regulation of a large industry if the outcome of it is maybe a slap on the wrist? We have like Google and the privacy, their use of private data that went through the US system, court system previously. They got a slap on, the Facebook, they got a slap on the wrist. We're at this point now where I think you as users need to have a good insight, or should be critically thinking and assessing the idea of, well, we have these solutions put forward, but what are they actually doing? And is it beneficial to us in any sense? So I kind of wanted to walk away with this idea, this like one sentence of, ultimately, as a researcher, as a designer, as someone involved in this area, at this point in time, it's my belief that you just need to understand your own moral and ethical position, because you're going to come into situations where it's ultimately not going to be on anyone else. You're going to be the one that's saying, yes, I can do this work, or no, I won't do this work. Sometimes there's regulations you can fall back on to justify that. Sometimes there aren't. So that's kind of just what I wanted to end on. I've been in this position. I'm sure many other people have been in this position, whether it's related to technology or not. But yeah, that's my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarita. It's fascinating, the ideas that you shared with us. Certainly, I have more questions now for the panel. Thank you so much. And I encourage you to, save your questions for the panel as well. I reckon the topic itself presents a lot of challenges. So now I want to invite Nicole to the stage. So she will share a little bit about her own research. So let me display you the slides. Over here.
Okay. All right, thank you, everyone. Excited to be here and really appreciate the introduction and the invitation, so thank you so much. I am going to take a little bit of a different track for my presentation. So I'm going to be talking about some of the research studies that I have done in the past couple of years and what were some of the ethical considerations that we needed to work out before we deployed these studies, as well as using this particular technology on a wider scale. So I wouldn't necessarily call myself an ethical designer per se, but we have looked at this process in the way that we have developed social science principles in human-robot interaction and human-robot teaming studies. This one? Yeah. Great. So I think this has been done quite nicely in the beginning of the talk, but I have a mixed background between behavioral science, robotics, as well as entrepreneurship in working closely with industry. However, for this particular study, I'll be taking a closer research tract. So I was always really interested in using behavioral science principles and what translates well into human-robot interaction and what doesn't because of the modality change, and what we can do differently to help make it as effective in some cases for human-human interaction. So for me, and the way I saw the lens of this research, is if we wanted to create really effective human-robot teamwork, we needed four things. We needed assessment tools to be able to test it. And in this case, what does it mean to create a test that clearly indicates what we are capturing? And are we sure that this is not biasing or persuading anyone to respond in a way that's not how they perceive the interaction, or if we're shoehorning it in that particular sense? We needed to deploy it to ensure that it works. So it's enough just to just to theorize and say this could be what's happening, but we absolutely need to test it. We need to benchmark it against other performances, and of course we want to improve these capabilities over time, because it's not until we measure and retest do we know whether we're getting closer to what it is we want to test in particular. So one study that I would like to talk about a bit more in depth today was stemming from my background in behavioral science, which is, what does it take to make a social robot a treatment agent? So having a social robot deliver a one-to-one interaction with a person, emulating a form of psychotherapy that is known to be effective in creating behavior change. Even that particular idea as a PhD study came with a lot of ethical considerations. What we do know from talk-based therapy is that it can be very effective at helping people make healthy changes in their lifestyle. So it's something that can be replicated in a grander scale by developing it across modalities, whether it's digital agents, whether it's robotics, and how can we use this to benefit people so they have more opportunity for one-on-one engagement while getting the same impact that they would normally get from seeing a psychologist, especially when the wait lists in Australia have blown out very, very long time. Some people are just not getting access to any form of treatment, and could a robot be a good mid-step towards that before they're able to see a psychologist? So what we wanted to do is test this theory, and we used a social humanoid robot to do this. So our choice of robot, of course, we went back and forth on what is the most appropriate way to do this. We landed on humanoid because we thought for people to engage and interact with a robot, it would give more of a sense of comfort and security, as well as familiarity. Since we can use gesturing and different ways the robot can move around to create a faster sense of understanding what the robot is doing and conveying in the session. So we did it as a pilot randomized controlled trial where we were testing against immediate and 4-week delay to see whether just engaging in that interaction can help people. So what we wanted to do is focus on key components in a psychological therapy that has been known to be quite effective. But all of this came with very strong considerations of how can we do it appropriately to ensure that we're supporting the person's sense of independence, but we don't necessarily want to trick them or feel like they're having a conversation with an agent that's all-knowing and can provide a sense of summarization or a comparison to what a psychological therapist would already be presenting. So to develop this, we mixed in a structure of key components that were delivered for the same way for everyone else. But then we used a set of open-ended questions to try and encourage and engage people to think about their responses and to talk about what the problem was within themselves. And this is really quite effective and a great way that a humanoid robot can help elicit this sense of security and comfort in people, because hearing ourselves talk about those particular challenges or goals that we want to enact for ourselves can be a really strong change, motivational change and driver. But because we were using this in such a sensitive treatment context, we needed to make sure that there was structure in the conversation. So if we're using any type of machine learning that can move in different directions based on each individual sentence, then we're potentially spiraling out quite broad really quickly, and we could instead actually be putting our potential patients at risk. So it needed to be a really fine balance between the two, of supporting independence but ensuring that there's support and security as they're going through the session. So we developed this in co-collaboration with a clinical psychologist, and this script went through many, many, many iterations because we wanted it to be generalizable to a large population of people, but also have the sense of support that was needed for this program to work. So what we did find is that having 2 60-minute sessions going through this conversational interaction could reduce people's consumption and snack behavior and episodes by about half, and people lost nearly 5 kilos on this particular program. So only 2 one-hour sessions and we can get really strong changes. In some instances, we don't see this with other types of programs or weight loss interventions. So this opened a really fascinating and interesting question. Firstly, do we always need a human to deliver this type of therapy? If not, how can we replicate this in a way that can help support other people, but ensure that we're not putting anyone at risk either? And because of this, we then followed up on a qualitative interview because we wanted to find out what exactly were the drivers behind this and what could we do differently to ensure that we can replicate this type of positive effect in other scenarios. This particular program, we also did a variation that was for young children with diabetes. So they too are also focusing on snack intake episodes, particularly if it might spike their insulin levels. So in translating this, we had even further considerations that we needed to think about. Are we including the parents in the conversation? Are we giving children the sense of independence and privacy to communicate with this type of program? What do we consider the thresholds of when we should intervene as researchers and pulling up the veil of it being delivered as an avatar with the robot as the key communicator in the room? So we did see similar or some drops in snack intake episodes for children as well. But there again, as we start to delve in more of these more complex tasks, we need to think about how can we make sure that there are appropriate safeguards in place. And there's still a lot of discussion and communication, and that's why multidisciplinary ethical design is going to become even more important, if not already important, as we start to expand into other areas in this particular realm. So I'll talk a little about what we found in those qualitative interviews. So what were people thinking? Why was it important for them? And what were the most salient topics? So the table on the right is a little bit small, but we'll talk through some of those main points. So we interviewed around 18 people that went through this program in 30-minute semi-structured interview sessions. We kept it very open-ended. So what was helpful for you? What did you think about having a robot therapist talking to you about things you wanted to change? And the 4 key themes we found was the robot as an entity and person. So talking about this one first, what we found were really, really strong connections with the robot therapist, despite it being very, very structured in the way that the program was delivered. And one thing that came up with nearly every participant was a sense of not feeling stigmatized to talk about their private behavior and having a sense of non-judgmental support in the way that the script was delivered. Because it was a robot, there was the assumption that there wasn't pre-learned biases or prejudice being brought in from a human therapist perspective. And for some people, that in itself was a very powerful draw card to doing this program, but also feeling like they could open up more. And when you open up more, it's a lot easier to find the core of the problem. We also found that initial expectations of a robot was really important. So how, as researchers, we were defining the session in terms of explaining to them their privacy, their sense of what is the capabilities of the robot, and making sure we're defining appropriately those staging and steps. Of course, user experience is something that always comes up. It needs to be easy to use. It needs to ensure that the person feels like they're in control of the session. And because it is a robot, they do have greater control of the session because they can trigger each component to move on in the next stages. There was also future program recommendations, and everyone, understandably so, wanted more interactivity or communication depth from the robot. Because it was a structured program, this wasn't necessarily a surprise, but what was a surprise is that it still had a strong effect despite being relatively neutral in its summarization and feedback. So we're very interested to explore this particular topic in different domains to find out what subpopulations would best suit. How can we ensure that everyone is aware and is consenting to the use of robot therapy? And who is it perhaps not suitable for? So we also need to better understand the boundaries of when robot therapy is just not going to be sufficient to support and perhaps might even be a bit harmful to use. For example, if there are people that have a severity of a particular threshold and that we just need to move them straight to clinical therapy straight away. So there's a lot of other things to be discussed. Now, because we're doing ethical design, I wanted to throw this particular study in as well. So while the topic is avoiding manipulation, we did a very small study to say, why is it important to avoid manipulation? And because what we could find out is that people are very easily persuaded and manipulated by social robots, particularly if they're in a humanoid sense. So social influence can potentially be way too powerful, which is why we need to be having these panel discussions today. And how can we start building some safeguards to ensure that this type of behavior doesn't replicate further in future? So this is not our core research, just to be clear, but to demonstrate why we're doing the research we do. So as you can see, our little robot friend has a pizza in the top right corner. Most people, or at least 40%, agreed to let the robot through a secure swipe card area access alone, simply because the robot explained it was carrying a pizza for someone beyond that door. So this is just on a university campus, but the impacts are very widespread, and we need to be able to communicate this clearly to people to be aware of potentially the robot Trojan in the room, because they are a piece of electrical equipment and they can be compromised similar to other types of electrical equipment or digital devices. We also used it in terms of extracting sensitive information. So we had a one-on-one conversation with a human and a person, and the robot would ask questions that might be similar to what you would expect on your banking security questions. So of course, all of this data was destroyed and it was kept confidentially and everything was safe on the data side. But 1 per minute of going, okay, what street did you grow up on? What was the name of your childhood pet? Could seem like very innocent questions, but could have some very nefarious outcomes. And when people aren't expecting robots to be compromised or to ask these kinds of questions, it can be quite easy to give up and divulge very sensitive information. And for the last one, we hid a USB in the room, and the robot instructed people to put USB in a computer. We had a 100% success rate of that particular action. So again, very, very simple tasks could have very widespread impact, particularly when it's not clear to the user of the robot when the robot could be compromised and when it's operating in its normal protocol for that particular day. So because we know social robots can be trusted, how do we start to have the conversation around security and ethical design? And what do we need to consider before we put robots into more sensitive spaces where this could become more widespread with just a little bit of computer knowledge on how to get into the robot to start moving it around in different ways? So I think that's perfectly 15 minutes. I'll leave it there, but happy to talk more about this work in the panel as follow-up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. A fascinating topic and a little bit scary, to be honest, now the state of art of the area. So yeah, definitely worth it to discuss later about this. Now I want to invite Haider to the stage. And I need a keyboard.
The last screen. You've already seen the slides. Okay. All right. Thank you for having me here, Eduardo, and thank you for the introduction. I sent him just 2 lines as an introduction. We fished that out of the internet, and also a very old photograph of mine. That's from my marriage. I've changed, clearly. But so ethics has always been like this overshadowing thing in the background of my research. It's never something I've directly engaged with. But I thought, seeing as the topic for this forum was fitting, I'd take this as an opportunity to shamefully plug my research, but also walk you through how ethics in various forms emerged in my research. I'm a speculative designer. A lot of my work relies on transdisciplinarity and creating what are called method assemblages. I'll go over that as well. A heavy burden of that has been understanding the more than human. It's a complex topic, complex conversations around what exactly, what even are humans, what is beyond the human, this post-human world that we're at some point entering or have already entered. So yeah, I thought I'd take this opportunity to walk you through that. Hopefully I can stay within the 15 minutes. So here's a quick snapshot of my background. I'm originally a printmaker. I come from fine arts, and I see myself as someone who stumbled into design, eventually stayed because he liked the research. I went into freelance graphic design, programming, front-end development. So it's nice to think that all these tools that we sort of collect over time, the experiences, they're like this toolbox that you can tap into for various projects or whatever you're researching, whatever you're doing. But in actuality, this is more or less how I function. And this is uncommon. It's not uncommon. Everyone is like this. We overlap in various ways. I'm never only a printmaker. I'm also a speculative designer. And whatever I'm doing tends to seep into those different areas in different ways. We are transdisciplinary, essentially, is what I'm getting at. And this has been the hook for my entire research, that irrespective of whatever I'm doing, I'm telling stories through my speculative design artifacts that I'm making, and they all tap into this nostalgic aspect of being a printmaker, tactility that's coming from there, or into making, or into programming in some form. Everything kind of stems from this point that I am essentially using philosophy as a design tool, which if you ask any philosopher is blasphemous, because you're not supposed to do that with philosophy. These are doctrines. They're written in stone in certain ways. They can be tinkered with, but they can't be ripped apart the way we do in design. But speculative design gives you the opportunity to do that. And that's what I like about this field as well. It lets me use these topics such as constructivism, anthropocentrism, and lay them as a foundation for something bigger, something else that might be innovative in some form. A lot of my research comes from these two main sources, Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, which is essentially an approach for creating a phenomenology of objects, how we engage on the phenomena of our interactions, what are the phenomena of these objects that are not human. And a carpentry of things, which comes from Ian Bogost's usage of object-oriented ontology to use making in a way to enact philosophical arguments. So if you want to talk about anthropocentrism, you want to talk about existentialism, how would you do it through an artifact? How would you do it through creation in some form? And he goes into much more detail. He's a programmer, so he goes into detail into how you can create programmer philosophers or designer philosophers that are using their craft in a way to answer these more complex questions. So method assemblages is how this all comes about in my work, and this is a concept coming from John Law's approach towards how the humanities and the disciplines that have emerged over time, the way research is done in these disciplines is inefficient because they're now tackling more complex and these wicked problems in different ways. So a more transdisciplinary approach is needed where you sort of create assemblages of different approaches together that eventually then will turn into their own interdiscipline. The three that I tap into mostly is speculative design for world building and storytelling, ludic design for creating ambiguous artifacts, purposefully ambiguous for enacting curiosity in different ways when whoever's engaging with them, and philosophical carpentry, which again taps into the big argument that I'm trying to talk about, more than human. How do we engage with technologies, these relationships that we've developed over time? How do we answer those questions? And I try to bring in an air of playfulness because of the nature of these topics, these questions, that light-heartedness kind of lets you enter into them and then drop the bomb with the bigger question. At least you have someone approaching it in a particular way. So I like to make my artifacts playful in some form to get to these deeper questions. So I'll just go over some projects that over time has been slowly nudging towards this more than humanness and our relationship with technology that we've fostered over time. This first one is the empathy engine. This was essentially a project that was trying to explore how do you create a Voight-Kampff machine or digital empathy. Voight-Kampff, if you're not familiar with the works of Philip K. Dick, or if you haven't seen Blade Runner, it's essentially in this dystopian science fictional world, you have humans and androids who coexist, and the only thing that differentiates them is empathy. So the Voight-Kampff machine was essentially in this science fiction an attempt at understanding and how can you actually calculate or measure empathy. It doesn't exist, of course. So this, this research was an attempt to see what would a void camp machine essentially look like if it did exist. The end result of this, and from my contribution, was essentially thinking of it as a software development kit. It's a collection of different libraries that are tapping into physiological measurements, measuring things from smartwatches, measuring things from anything that you have on your person, wearables, to sort of create empathy or understand what empathy would possibly be like, or create that bond between the human and this technology. Various different outputs were imagined for this, including doctor-patient interactions, with doctors actually understanding specific pain, how that's being computed, or even something more banal as you have had a very rough day, so your car decides to give you the scenic route so you can calm down a bit, so you can have relax a bit. It's just about the technology being able to relate to you on a human level. But this wasn't really more than human, of course. I'm still relating back to the human. So how do we step away from that? I figured let's go even more deeper, and if there's a phenomenology of interactions with humans and the way humans engage with the world, what about the phenomenology of digital objects and the interfaces that we have? This particular project was part of a very long acronym for any project, Prejudice, in true European policy fashion. Prejudice stands for Privacy, Ethics, Trust, Risk, Accessibility, and Security in the Internet of Things. So this project was essentially looking at various different angles of how we interact with the phenomenon of the Internet of Things. And my contribution here was to see it again from that more than human perspective. If there's a phenomenology of humans, what is the phenomenology of objects, and then with these spaces that we've created, digital, non-digital spaces that we interact with. Right now, I'm in the physical room, I'm interacting with you in a physical way, but you are tapping into my thoughts through this digital screen that I've put out in front of you. So we are interacting on two different spaces in this context. So how does that even exist if you're designing meaningful interactions that should relate back to the human in certain ways that make sense to them, that can have an impact? And this model kind of was a deep dive into how you can use philosophy to carpenter an artifact that might in some form be able to tap into these complex questions and answer them. It uses Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopias to create these places of otherness. So the digital realm that we interact with, either on our smartphones or in this case the projection, is its own heterotopia with its own rules and regulations. So if you're designing interfaces, you can use the model to understand how deep in the rabbit hole of these different heterotopias have I gone. Each of them have this different set of rules that relate back to the real world in some way. But of course, it's a very dense topic. It is going straight into phenomenology. So how do we then pull it back and make sense out of it so that something practical can actually come out? This is the Internet of Things board game that essentially is a reimagining of the entire model in a playful way so that you can get people to understand their digital footprint and understand what it means to live these double lives, where on the one hand, you are also a human interfacing with the world around you using these devices. On the other hand, you have accumulated a digital footprint of yourself, a version of yourself online. So as you play the game, you shift between being the human user to becoming these devices, navigating these different rooms, these physical spaces, to then eventually becoming the data itself and understanding who you are from that context. The whole point of this game was to nudge closer and closer towards that more than human aspiration or understanding of what is the more than human, and slowly making more sense of it. But we often engage with the technology in various ways, and the biggest hurdle facing that is how do you communicate what a technology is going to give back to you, to the user. The Uncanny AI project essentially was an attempt at making sense of this by taking actual people who are living their daily lives and putting them into scenarios where they would face artificial intelligence, they would face technology in this new light. The result was creating a laundry label of sorts for AI, But the whole point behind that was provoking this concept. What would you want to live in a world where you have to read technology like this? What happens if if that kind of a world is actually opened up? It was an interesting approach towards more than humanness, mostly from a practical standpoint, because of the limitations of the project. But there were certain ethical questions that emerged between the Internet of the Things board game and this project specifically, which made me think I still haven't really tapped into the more than human side of things here. I'm still very much hugging the human. So what happens once you just let go of the reins completely and dive as deep as you can into understanding more than humanness? So that's where one of the possibly the most obscure artifact I've ever made when it comes to this project, this entire more than human design topic comes about. The Tarot of Things, as I call it, is essentially an online digital seer service for objects that exist on the internet, that connect with the internet. It's made in Python. It does what it can do to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, there are some limitations to it as well. But the whole point behind this is to nudge that point further. What do you do when you have to deal with the design of machines that are not really human but are pretending to be human? We're now facing the sort of a dilemma where we're working with AI that is modeled off of humans. It's not really a human being. But creating these kind of artifacts is nudging that point further of how do you answer these complex questions? What if you had to design for a guilty AI or design for a vengeful Roomba? How are you going to essentially approach that? And these transdisciplinary approaches, carpentry, speculative design, if anything, has given a platform to approach these dense topics. That brings me to where I am right now with trans objects. And this is probably going to be just as obscure. It's an attempt at understanding transhumanism, but from an object's perspective, the way we are attempting to transform ourselves through technology. What if technologies were given the ability to do that themselves in various ways? This is, again, tapping into our perceived notions or the definitional dualism that sort of exists with how we relate with technology. Things that how people see robots, they might think of killer robots, they might think of the Terminator or whatever. Or even they think about AI, they think about everything is constantly watching me and creating a version of myself. So the trans objects is essentially an attempt to bridge that gap and slowly nudge forward towards what this post-human world might be, where we're living with, again, these devices, objects that are not human but pretending to be human. So how do we design for them? How do we take this objective stance towards them? And one of the biggest hurdles I think I've faced as far as this research goes is that it's always thought that it's stepping away from human-centeredness, and that's not the case. We're humans, so irrespective of whichever more than human stance we take, we do need to return to the human. More than humanness is mostly seen from ecology's perspectives. This is taking it from a technological turn. And while human-centered design is, it's a de facto modus operandi that we have when dealing with any of these problems, but we have created a sort of messy interactions because of the fact that we're trying to design for things that are not human by thinking them as human or using the same practices. And I think this is where speculative design becomes quite useful for tapping into these, answering questions like what are the ethics in AI? It's a complex question that requires some sort of transdisciplinary approach. You need to be, some level of speculation will be needed in order to become innovative. And I think that's kind of where I want to end this, but I'd like to first end on I think I have a little time. I'll end on a quote. This is from the Red Dwarf. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this TV series in the 90s. It's a dystopian dark comedy and set in the future on a mining vessel somewhere in space. And there's this toaster in that can talk. It has AI in it. It's a toaster that has AI. And it has this all the knowledge in the world, all this information, but at the end of the day, it's just a toaster, which is quite interesting to think. And one particular quote that always gets me is that, see, knowing that God is infinite and the universe is infinite, would you like a toasted tea cake? The point being that if we're designing for objects that are not meant to be this vast and not meant to be that obscure, we don't need to be taking approaches that don't fit them. If these objects are not human, then it doesn't make sense to approach them from a human-centered perspective, perhaps seeing their worldviews or whatever thing ethnographies they might have might be a better way to at least nudge closer to this new world that we're interfacing with. Yeah, that's where I'll be ending.
Fascinating again. I just find super interesting when you mention all these concepts, Heider. Now I want to invite Scott Brown. So let me set up your slides. And, let me find the slides somewhere here. Scott. Yeah, here is the first one.
That's the first one.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Eduardo. Hi, everybody. This slide here is how I start most of my talks and classes these days. I am a researcher who works with neurodivergent populations, and this text comes from Autism Spectrum Australia. And it's just to say that please engage with this and spend this time in a way that makes sense for you. If you feel like you need to stand up, if you need to move around, if you need to open the window, if you need to interrupt me because I'm mumbling again, please do. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I don't think we can talk about ethics without talking about bias and prejudice and privilege. So there's some irony in a white guy talking to you about privilege today. So I want to talk about how I started my work and research from a place very different to where I've ended up, and how I kind of got there through the experiences I had with the populations that I worked with. So I studied digital media here at COFA, back when it was called COFA. It's now a media arts degree. And I did a lot of work with interactive technologies, lots of sensory experiences. And I was really fortunate that one of my friends who works at an autism school came along to an exhibition and said, hey, this stuff would be really interesting with our kids in the classroom and maybe even in clinical settings. And that was sort of the catalyst for what became a research career. This was a project I did at the end of that degree in my honours year, where I worked with a 2-year-old girl with autism in her home with her mother and an occupational therapist to try and understand what sensory interaction was most appealing or interesting to her. When I did this project, kind of embarrassingly now I look back on it and think what I was trying to achieve here was a very neurotypical, able-bodied kind of hope that I could get her to communicate in a way that I communicate through these objects. So that might be through speech or text or those sorts of methods of communication. So what I did that year was through a succession of different objects, I gave them to her, observed her interactions with them and thought about how that might inform the next stage of the design process for me. The most interesting part of that project was with the second device, which I've pulled out here, which was basically a series of joysticks that vibrated differently depending on which orientation you moved them. There was a moment that the girl, whilst interacting with that, looked to her mother for this moment of like social engagement. What the occupational therapist told me was joint attention, and a really important developmental milestone for that particular girl. And that kind of was a bit of a light bulb moment for me to sort of take me in a slightly different direction and think about, okay, what is my role here? As somebody who's designing these objects, what is it that I'm actually trying to achieve? And I started moving towards this idea that I'm actually making space for someone else to express themselves in a way that makes sense for them. I took this concept into PhD work where early on I watched a video on YouTube, which I encourage everyone to take a look at. It's called In My Language by Mel Baggs. In the video is run twice visually. In the second running of it, it is subtitled. The first time you watch it through, if you're not familiar with autistic people, you might think this is kind of stereotypical interactions, a lot of rocking, stimming is the term often used, touching objects, rubbing them, that sort of thing. But then Mel goes on to describe what they're actually doing there is a way of communicating, that it's actually a back and forth between them and their environment. And this was a kind of another light bulb moment for me to think about, like, what can interaction do with people who perhaps can't express themselves verbally or through written word. And I moved into using ideas in cybernetics around conversation theory. What is a conversation? Who is that between? Is it between people, objects, or both? And spent 4 years building a tent for my PhD. It was, literally a tent, with lights and sound around the outside. It was a space designed for autistic children and their parents to come and interact in a non-directive way. So I started really kind of leaning into this possibly speculative, open idea of interaction and trying to see what happens, to try not and kind of take my biases into the way that I'm designing objects. Again, the most interesting part was something totally unexpected. So the 3 iterations of interfaces across the right-hand side there. The second one was kind of this peg in a hole thing where you put a yellow peg in the hole and the lights turn yellow. It didn't work. The camera underneath just technically didn't work. But what did happen there was, in those moments of the thing not functioning the way that it was supposed to, the child actually went to their parent for assistance or engaged with them socially, communicated to them, and I could actually observe what previously was an internal dialogue, perhaps, as an external event. So that was an idea that I've kind of explored in more detail around disrupting an interaction. So allowing someone to first kind of establish the rules of engagement, how does the system work, does it make sense, and then taking that away. And then when that's taken away, often there's in HCI the idea is called a breakdown, where something that was previously an internal process becomes external and observable. So from here, I've, in a way, kind of moved away from technology. I call myself technology agnostic these days. A lot of my work is kind of low-tech, and it's all about how do we make space for these people to be very engaged and involved in a co-design process. Co-design as a term, I think, is absolutely misused all over the place, as is empathy. And if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard this quote before. I think it's amazing. Mike Montero wrote an excellent book, Ruined by Design, which kind of speaks to this idea really well. What about empathy? Empathy is a pretty word for exclusion. I've seen all male, all white teams taking empathy workshops to see how women think. If you want to know how women would use something you're designing, get a woman on your design team. They're not extinct. We don't need to study them. We can hire them. And that applies equally, I think, for any population you're claiming to design with. It is very much the case in tech that it's rooms full of people that look like me, designing for people that don't look like me. Doing empathy maps, doing personas, scenarios, it isn't the same as getting the people that you're designing with in the room, paying them, and asking them what they need. before that design takes place. Another quote, this is from Liz Jackson, who's an amazing disability advocate and author. What comes out of tech quite a lot is this idea that she coined the disability dongle, which is, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's this idea that we have people who are designing for the disability community who have no experience of disability, who are creating these techno solutions, and they're kind of elevated, I suppose, by media or whomever else as being this kind of heroic problem solver. And ultimately, these things don't actually solve any problem because they haven't engaged with the community that they're supposed to be working with or supporting. So this is just a couple of projects I'm working on at the moment, all about how do we include those voices. First of all, something that I'm quite proud of that we've worked on here on our campus, at the Paddington campus, is the Autism Friendly Campus project. And we now have resources for neurodivergent people to join us here on campus. So it's one thing to sort of say that we're working in this space, it's another to actually create space for these people to work in. So these resources are all on our website now. It's starting from the left, that's called a visual story, something that you may have come across before. Basically a document that says, hey, this is what you might expect when you come to campus. There's a lot of things which fall into what we call the hidden curriculum. So all these kind of social things that happen on campus that you perhaps aren't familiar with and can be sort of overwhelming or anxiety provoking for people who are unfamiliar with them. We go through all of that. There we've also got an accessibility map and sensory maps. So we talk about where you might encounter loud sounds or smells or visual stimulus. And finally, we ran hidden disability sunflower training for our staff. So roughly 3/4 of our staff took this up, which is really great. It's something that started in the UK where somebody with a hidden disability, so it might be autism or could just be anxiety, might want to wear a sunflower to show that they might need a little bit more time, need a little bit of help. We flipped that idea on its head a bit here, and our staff who've done the training wear a sunflower to be identifiable by people who might need some extra help. So if they don't want to identify as having a hidden disability, they still know where they can come for some support. And finally, a project that I'm working on at the moment with Sarita, the autism-friendly sporting events. Sarita and I were lucky enough to go and spend the weekend at the MCG last weekend, looking at how stadiums in Australia are starting to support different people to come to the sport, or it could be a music event at a stadium. If they ever feel overwhelmed or they need some time out, they can take themselves to these sensory spaces to regulate or get respite. This one here is Combank Stadium out at Parramatta. We're going out there tomorrow night to interview parents of families who have autistic children, and across the bottom we're going to give activity books to the children themselves to let them express what the whole game day experience is like for them. Again, this is another thing that's trying to be non-directive in that we're not asking them to answer a set of multiple choice questions or anything like that. It is a colouring and sticker book that they can express how they feel about coming to sporting events, how they feel about packing their bags, getting to their seat, where they find amenities, all of that sort of thing, in a way that makes sense for them. So they can take that away, do it in their own time, and send it back to us. And that's it. That's kind of where we are. Thanks, Eduardo.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. I love the term technology agnostic. I would love to join to the call, definitely. I think, after 10 years in research, I guess all of us become a little bit like that. Wonderful. So now let me move the slides. And we will have the panel discussion. And I was thinking that maybe could be a good idea if we move the chairs here in the front, and then we have a very nice discussion with the attendees of the event. Sorry that you have to move your own chairs. I can help. Just be careful with your eyes on the projector. Thank you. So yeah, careful with the eyes. You need them for the next 60 or 70 years. Yeah, well, I have a lot of questions for you in this panel. But I was thinking, on the other hand, maybe it could be productive to have a more organic discussion, and maybe we can open the floor for questions from the attendees, and then we can do a mixed approach to that. So I was wondering if you already have questions for the panelists at the moment. Yes, please. Let me give you the... Thank you so much, Ali.
I think that's working.
Hello. Thank you for your fabulous presentations. They were very, very interesting. So I'm just going over my notes. I wasn't on Facebook this whole time. I was writing notes about your presentations. So just a couple of things. I've just got a couple of questions for a couple of the speakers. So in terms of, I believe it was Sarita, sort of talking about ethics in projects. And I think one of your points was, if I'm getting this right, sort of as a sort of designer or a creator, you need to sort of come to a project with your own values or your own ethics in, I guess, a decent place. But I was wondering, is there surely like sort of a need for tapping into an organization, say mission, vision, and values, to ensure that they are taking responsibility for their own, I guess, DNA of sorts when it comes to ethics, and what your thoughts were about, so outside, you mentioned in the university framework that you sort of look at ethics in an experiment, as on the experiment and not the idea. And I'm sort of interested in your thoughts of like applying considerations across the life cycle of a project, like in the design, data gathering, implementation, assessment, KPIs, whatever they are, like at the very beginning of a project, having a life cycle approach to the ethics of that.
Yeah, okay.
Set of questions.
Sounds like there's two questions to that. I'll answer the second part first, then maybe we can revisit the first. I think when I think of ethics in a university framework, right, the reason why I said it seems to be specifically about like harm into the user and it doesn't necessarily seem to be about the idea, and why that responsibility falls on you as a researcher, is that because there are many instances where there are ideas generated at universities, at Australian universities, which go on to directly harm people outside of the university context. Whether these are picked up by ethics panels or not shouldn't be the final passing call. The example that everyone should be aware of is the use of facial recognition technology that was developed at UTS to identify Uyghurs within China. And if you go back to the funding of that project, you can see that there's conflicting interests throughout the whole thing. This is a wide scope issue, and researchers on this project were aware of what was going to happen. So I think that, again, we can have this idea of these are wide-scale things, but at the end of the day, you're a researcher working on an idea, and whether you understand how that idea will be used in the real world, whether you're designing for that, you still need to take scope into the potential other elements and applications of that research idea. I mean, it was really great what Nicole was saying about the idea of privacy. Like, there's all of this untapped potential for technology and the impact it can have on the public. But whether or not we're at a point at the moment to understand what that is, whether some people do and are already taking advantage of that, it's all big question marks at the moment. So from my insight on what it is to be a designer, a researcher within a university context, I think it is good to be able to take scope of these things in a wide perspective. But at the end of the day, if the intent is malicious, the intent will always be malicious. And then if we go on to the first part of your question, which could you just quickly give me a...
So the first one was about a life cycle, and the other was about, because I was thinking in your more professional context, not just your university ones.
So the first was like more industry-based, So if we're focusing on the idea of, well, if you're in an industry project and the company you work for has a set of ethical principles that they've publicly announced, but they're asking you to do work that is counter to that, sure, like you as a researcher can flag that. You can flag that to managers. It ends up being a difficult balancing act, though, because what you're doing is saying, okay, well, if they don't want me to do this, if I'm going to say no to doing this, is there a potential way to encourage them in a different direction, or will they get someone else? And I want to reiterate the idea that, you know, we're in a university, we're researching ideas, and ideas can have applications in a whole array of places. But if you don't do this work, someone else will. And that's a dangerous idea to sit with, right? So it's like, what can you do in this space? And where is your moral decision and decision-making? Where is your moral compass on when are you going to avoid taking the responsibility? When are you going to say this is too much? And when are you going to put in the work? And unfortunately, it's extra work. It's additional work to try and influence people above you to go in a different direction. But I'm going to say, unfortunately, often as a researcher, that's the job that you take if it falls within your moral compass. Does that help?
Yeah, and I'm just imagining though, so as the researcher, like in the upfront, so I'm actually doing sort of a small side racket bit of research in the space myself for a branding and marketing company. And I was like, hey, before I do anything for you, like we're going to do some ethics research because I need to understand what jobs am I destroying, what risks of misinformation am I spreading, how could this be used in the extreme case of it being a bad thing, how am I going to talk to like future generations when they look back and say, hey, what fossil fuels were for the boomers, AI is for your generation. So like, how can I be sure that what I'm doing, either I put in checks and balances myself and flag things or boundaries, and I've got a background in policy as well. So it's like, okay, what do I put up or what do I flag now at the big, and that's why I'm sort of talking about the life cycle as well. It's like, how do I know this is getting out of hand or not? What can I say as the upfront researcher or designer? What am my considerations for the life cycle of this work I'm doing?
Look, I think it's a great conversation to have, and especially with whoever you're doing this project with, being able to, if it isn't an established thing as part of your project, that you're going forward and saying, I want to do this research and I want to have this kind of thing stated out.
And we are.
And I definitely think, you know, I threw up some regulations, I threw up some kind of government directions around this type of research. I think these are great resources, right? I'm not going to fall into regulation as the be-all and end-all. Again, and this is a personal belief, but I believe that we're individually and independently responsible for our own actions in our lives. So I would highly encourage you to absorb all of the resources available, make educated decisions alongside with companies that you're working for, and at the end of the day, until there's something more concrete, and I wish I could provide you with the like, you know, the $1 million ticket question is, what do we do to make this better? And I honestly spent the whole morning walking here thinking about that. I was like, oh, someone's gonna ask me, what is the solution? And I don't have one. Maybe there will be a solution in the future, maybe there won't. But all I can say I'm doing is I'm putting in stops and methods to make sure that my actions in this space adhere to what I hope others would also. That's it. That's my end. I end there.
Can I also ask a second question? I'm sorry to hog the mic. This is a completely different one. I think it's for Haydar. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. And you were just mentioning post sort of more than human-centered design. And I was just sort of interested because like I do a bit of a human-centered design practitioner as well. Just interested because obviously HCD is to like identify sort of human needs and address them and the opportunities in solving those problems. And I was just wondering if you're doing sort of more than that for like non-human entities, is that the assumption that they have needs?
It's a good question. Do they have needs? Well, definitely, to some degree. We've created these devices, objects, in a way to make our lives better. So in one perspective, to say that their needs are to do that essentially is a reciprocal thing. But the way technology is going, if the future stance that we want to take as humans and with this relationship with technology is where they are almost symbiotic in some way, they've merged with us in some form, either through transhumanistic perspectives, biohacking, or whatever, that opens its own can of worms around ethics. How are you going to live in that kind of a world? What other things are possible? In that sense, then yes, then those particular technologies would have different needs if that is how you want to approach it. That's a very, very far away perspective of how, maybe human-centered design would eventually evolve into something that's more than human. These are baby steps right now. More than humanness is typically seen from an ecological perspective, our relationship with the environment and our impact on the environment. This is a technological turn that is also observed through using philosophy and all of that. So currently, I don't think we can say that they have certain needs. It is a very obscure space to be in as well as a researcher, mainly because of these kind of questions. We don't have answers to them, and I think that's fine, as long as it pushes the boundaries a bit towards something more innovative, something more meaningful.
I guess that's a question.
Yep. It's kind of for all of you, but mostly probably for Scott, because you talked a lot about this journey that you were on where you started at a certain place and then you realized that you were coming at it from your perspective, that your perspective was quite privileged, and then that you moved through this sort of ethical journey. You used to be our ethics officer. I used to do ethics at my old job, and it was largely administrative. I didn't really think about it until we started working together, and people started saying, no, you got to put these things in place. And I'm like, but everybody cares about people. No, everybody doesn't care about people, all that kind of thing. And I hear Sarita, because I know her a little bit, I can hear her fighting for some of the stances that she's taken and speaking to some of those things. And I just wonder if there's an inclusivity pathway or something that would educate people in ethics, not just as like a philosophy or administration we have to do to get our project underway, but and I mean, I don't know, maybe the answer is religion or something, but I just wondered if you could maybe share a little bit about that.
It's a tricky one. Human research ethics application, let's be honest, it's in place to protect the university, to protect the institution. It does a couple of things well in terms of, I guess, the ethical chat we're having, in that you need to start thinking about what's the value to the person of study. And I think those ideas are really important. And it's something that we should bring out more in that ethical application process. I was listening to Sarita's answer earlier, and I'm going to reference Mike Monteiro again. If you haven't heard, he's put together this code of ethics for designers. It's a living document, and you can go in and add and edit it. But his whole kind of philosophy with that is, too often these tough positions, a lot of the time, have to be taken by junior people. So they might be contract workers, junior researchers, junior designers, and they have to say no to people with not much in way of ethics. And that's a really hard place to be. What Monteiro says about his code of ethics is that it's much like the Hippocratic Oath of doctors. If everybody's adhering to these ethics within a domain, whether it's health, medicine, or design, then that makes that conversation a lot easier. Yeah. You don't have to worry about your job to say no. I think what we're talking about here is ethically dubious. So, yeah, I think there's a couple of ways forward there. Rightfully so, our ethics application comes from like the medical model. I think a lot of university research did a lot of harm in that space for a very long time. And so, you have to tick off that you're not injecting people with radioactive whatevers. It doesn't apply so much to us, but I'd like to see more of the kind of humanities in that process, like not only are you not causing harm physically, because that's kind of what it's about a lot of the time, but longer term harm, perhaps emotionally or mentally, and those sorts of things as well.
Thank you.
I have another question over here.
Hi, so this is kind of for Nicole, but also possibly for Hader. I was interested when you said that you developed the questions that your robot was asking based on a human psychologist. And I was just wondering how you went about, obviously this was a very small scope project, but in the interest of expanding it, how do you consider the hazards of digitizing and extrapolating that person's personal biases, or the biases within data sets that you may be training these systems on? And I was wondering if this is something that could be helped by possibly moving away from human-centered design, or just what your thoughts are on that.
When we were coming up with the script, we did a phenomenal amount of iterations. We had multiple clinical psychologists involved in it, and we struck out and rewrote so many pieces of it. So we were always very conscious of what we were writing in and ensuring that it was as close to evidence-based therapy that had already been supported from the clinical psychology space. But what we also know is that digital versions without robots or any sort of avatars have also been quite effective as well, if those particular components are emulating helpful technique training or components within the therapy that work quite well. So fitting it to a robot wasn't necessarily too much of a stretch, because we already had a pretty good base to work on, but just needed to have it come across a bit more like an agent was delivering it, rather than you were doing it through a website and clicking through page by page by page. So I think there's still things that could be done better in the script on future iterations, now that we've heard what people have said and responded to. But what we were more thinking about is, it needed to be humanized at least a little bit. So it needed to come across a little bit more genuine than full sort of, stone dry reading of this particular script. And we wanted to be really careful about that, to not overemphasize the humanness of it, that it maybe became potentially a little bit condescending. So there were so many things we had to consider. But part of, I think, people attributing a sense of humanness to the robot, I think, is what also worked in the therapy as well, because they genuinely felt like there was a companion that was supporting them and wanting them to make their goals and help them support through that change. So I think there's always going to be a really careful calibration. For some, they might want it to be more anthropomorphized and others less, and that's something to consider in future iterations. But we were definitely very, very careful in how we wanted to script it, but that script will need to change to suit different types of people to ensure that it's safe to use on a wider population.
I think in terms of using more than human design, the biggest hurdle that you end up facing is the fact that we are human, and we can only think from a human perspective. That's why human-centeredness works. We can understand human context, but I can't understand what a toaster's perspective of a toaster's world is, or what data essentially is. So that's the biggest hurdle. And there are approaches that have been developed for taking those perspectives, but they're also met with a lot of friction. Philosophy helps here, and maybe taking some sort of stance that would definitely at least open a door to understanding how we relate with data, or how what are the ethics essentially involved in these sort of interactions. Karen Barard's A Gentle Realism makes a lot of sense, but then again, these are very, very dense topics that we're dealing with. Whenever you bring in any kind of more than human research, more than human design, you'll probably end up facing more resistance than actually leading somewhere that is actually fruitful, which is a shame. But I think there's room for these conversations. to understand what is the ethics of the kinds of technologies that we're developing. If they can't be solved by just taking human perspectives, then maybe stepping aside and taking an objective stance is necessary. And that's all the more than human-centered design is. We will need to eventually return to the human. All of my projects that I've been working on, they end up in the same direction. Okay, you've done this more than human perspective, but you need to then relate it back to us. Even the ecological perspectives that we take from more than humanness, why are we even taking them? To make our human lives better by improving the environment, by improving our influence on things. But we are still observing them from a different vantage point is all it is.
I think the second part of your question I didn't necessarily answer was around dataset usage and biases within that. The way that a clinical psychologist speaks to a patient is very, very different from a way a friend speaks to another friend. It's basically a completely different model and something that we need to be really careful in how we consider wanting to train and deploy. And I don't think we have something that's fully suitable for use in the clinical space. So something that provides that reflectiveness and something that has been trained to deliver responses that look like clinical practice, that can handle really large sort of unstructured requests and discursive discussion. So if we wanted to translate what's already available and pretend it works perfectly in clinical psychotherapy, I think that's quite dangerous and could have some safety concerns. But we'd need to build something brand new that emulates what a therapist would say in certain situations and identifying those thresholds. But there's subtle nuances that you just can't capture yet in the way that people convey information that could signal potential risk on the patient trying to express it, but hasn't specifically used those direct words. And that's just a whole nother kettle of fish that will come up in the design of the therapy if we're using data sets to help boost that conversational language.
I wanted to. Oh, we've got one over there. Great.
Yeah, we have plenty of time. No worries.
I'll jump in and then I'll throw the mic to you. Not literally. I wanted to ask a question. I think primarily to Haida, and then I think everyone might want to jump in with a view. It was great to see your work properly, and very. The more than human design area is super interesting, and it's great that we have you here. And I want to know how the landscape of interdisciplinary teams is changing from your perspective. I want to know what it's like from on the ground where you are. I think we all have perspectives on this.
Yep.
What you're seeing, and particularly in this new no longer new, but mega faculty that we've formed.
Yeah.
What you see as being opportunities and challenges.
I think all of these approaches, all these projects that I was on, it was never just a designer. I had programmers involved to help me to create these artifacts. I had people from business perspectives, from policy perspectives to help with this as well. One project I didn't put in there was about creating policies for AI as well. And it was essentially understanding how reliable and how to mitigate risk factors. This was back when GDPR was still being figured out. It wasn't really enforced yet, and all these other things that are happening in the UK. Now we're facing the impact of that, where we actually have to sit down and think about what is creativity when it comes to AI. When you've got things like Midjourney, you've got ChatGPT, etc., creating versions of human-like things when they're not human. So the opportunities are there if there's actually people are willing to jump on board, is essentially what I'm trying to hopefully get at. Speculative design gets a lot of eye rolls as well when people saying, "Oh, it's speculative. It's not real in that sense." But all of the artifacts that I shared were physical things. There were things that tangible in some form or created that you can actually interact with. And the whole point is to create provocation. So opportunity will lie wherever anyone is willing to actually, place themselves in that conversation. Currently, with the faculty that we have right now, I'm seeing a lot of hope. I'm hopeful, at least, that merging with the built environment, There's a lot of potential space there for exploring how we relate with the technologies that are in these spaces, and maybe using some phenomenological approach, or using a more than human design approach, or just sticking within human-centeredness itself. There's still a lot of possibility. It's just about being able to tap into that and having people willing to ask these difficult questions and willing to, maybe even have fun with them. I think that's been a big part of my research, the playfulness, having that lighthearted air of, okay, I'm going to make a set of tarot cards for the Internet of Things and just see what happens. That itself was a building block for a bigger conversation of just reaching that point of asking a question like, what is a guilty AI, or what is a vengeful Internet of Things device, toaster, or whatever you have it. Those questions came about through having these transdisciplinary engagements with different people and different groups of people together.
I might just add to that. So within industry now, the hot term is cross-functional. So it's like almost every year they change what the word is. What I wanted to say is that sometimes you'll end up on a team where everyone thinks that what they do is the most important part of the project, right? I think that's the most difficult part of a cross-functional team, is that making sure that you can negotiate, navigate, and create a shared space to converse about why everyone on that team is there and how you all work together to get to the end goal. If I relate that back to where you see ADA at the moment, it's great that we're merging with spaces. I mean, the idea that we can have these types of technologies integrated with spaces and explore those ideas more readily, it's positive, but we're still a silo. We're still a silo within a university that's doing similar research, like physically in a different location. Unless we're able to come together and discuss these ideas in a truly cross-functional, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary way, we're going to hit these same ethical issues that we're already hitting. So like being able to open up this conversation, open up this space, open up ideas and have people come in and sit in a place where they're allowed to be flexible. We're in academia, everyone is quite rigid in having to justify what they're doing as being the most important thing. But being able to take a step back, be flexible in thinking about why is it that someone else's work is important and how does that integrate or interface with mine? I think that's just something that I wanted to tack on to the end.
Totally right. I think the whole point of having a transdisciplinary approach towards anything like now is, why is it necessary? We're no longer dealing with disciplines that are these cookie cutter things that we've had for such a long time. You're now merging with lots of different disciplines together. So at some point they will turn into their own things, their own interdisciplines. Ethical AI might be its own thing, but it will rely on things from psychology. It'll rely on things from technological spaces and other places as well. So we just need to be open to that, and open to the fact that you will need to ask difficult questions, or even questions that don't make any sense, such as tarot cards for the Internet of Things.
Wonderful. I guess there is a question from Max in the back, and then I have a couple of open questions, but please, Max.
Yes, a couple of questions, if you don't mind. The first one is about the role of philosophy. Actually, you have already mentioned this multiple times, but I'd like to ask you, I had the feeling that, these days ethics is very important, it's everywhere, especially in the discourse about technology. Everybody has ethical intuitions, and the discourse on ethics belongs to everybody. So I don't think there is any risk of appropriation of ethics by someone who is not an ethicist. But at the same time, if we ask ourselves, who are the professionals of ethics? I mean, who has the kind of PhD or who works in the disciplinary area that specifically correspond to a specific competence, academic competence, research competence in ethics? They are supposed to be philosophers. Also, in terms, if you look at ARC the discipline codes and so on. Ethics is under philosophy. But then I'm surprised that in the multidisciplinary teams of roboticists or people working in social robotics, still there are not so many philosophers. And also in general, groups working on autonomous technology, like in March, we organized a seminar with a very important researcher in Europe who is running this multi-million project on autonomous transportation, which is all focused on ethical issues and how to make ethical transportation. So I asked him, well, so I guess in your such a large team, you have hired a number of philosophers. I said, no, actually, we forgot. So, but I will say, maybe philosophers have to be blamed a little bit for this, because maybe there are many philosophers who are keen on expressing their opinions in general about ethics of technology and this and that, but when it comes to working together, really doing the multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of teaming, they prefer to stay more in their little comfort zone. No? This is the first question. The second one, if the first one was not provocative enough, the second one is, but do we really need all this ethics after all? I mean, I want to ask you, if you as designers and creators of technology, don't you feel that at some point all this attention on ethics is constraining your creative capabilities in the sense that, like 60 years ago, if we look at science fiction and we see how robot creators were portrayed, they were not that kind of ethical. I mean, they were more like a mad scientist, but they were mad scientists that were really in love with their creation, so they were pursuing creation for the sake of creation. And when you're you are involved like an artist, your activity is amoral. Not in the sense that it's unethical, but in the sense that ethical concerns are not immediately what you're focusing on. Maybe they come later. So I want to ask you if in the creative process there is a moment in which you have to put into bracket the ethical concerns and say, well, we'll discuss this later because now I'm just pursuing creation for the sake of. And if it's an unethical monstrosity, okay, that's something to be worried about, but I don't want to be worried at this particular moment in time in which I'm doing the mad scientist and the creative job. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it.
Can I ask to Max's question? Can I ask a question? And it's a question as well for everybody in the panel. What are your thoughts about having an ethics unit in every school, every faculty, every university, in the same way that we have a IT department and a statistics consultancy? What about the ethicist that is becoming part of the project? Will be interesting for you as a researchers, the practicalities about productivity and innovation and novelty. If you can elaborate in these three questions, could be great. So I don't know who wants to start. Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'll try and field some of that. So I think the problem with the mad scientist approach now, like if we look back at people experimenting with LSD on themselves, like way back, sure, that was like nobody's being hurt, possibly yourself, but that's your own choice, right? Now we're making platforms that have the reach and potential to cause so much harm on like a very different scale. So I think it's really important to back that up. And Facebook, great example. Like you just send this stuff out into the ether. If Mark Zuckerberg designs this thing that's all about understanding how certain articles might upset teenage girls, and he did, and people committed suicide through that. He's not the kind of person that's going to be affected by that choice, right? So I think it's really, really important that those decisions are made right up front. The philosopher approach to ethics is an interesting one as well, because I think it almost is the same issue. Like, if these people are making the decisions, they should bear the results. I think like your stereotypical philosopher of throwing big ideas out into the world and just sort of seeing what happens, like provoking people and that sort of thing. If you want to have some sort of say in the ethics of a technology or a platform or something, then I think you need to stand by that and be involved with the process. So yeah, I think it is kind of a slightly different can of worms that we have now around the ethics of designing technologies.
Maybe we can go to the other end and come back.
It's a really interesting one, because when we think about it from an engineering perspective, we want a concrete answer. And we want to be able to know, okay, tell me, what do I program into my algorithm? You know, what direction do I program the car to tilt in if it's about to have a collision? And trying to meet on the same page is an interesting one. You know, we can't necessarily have all these scenarios computed in all these different ways when we need to make split decisions. We sort of need to know what we're planning to do beforehand. And I've asked a few philosophers before of, okay, if it got down to it, would it be A or B that we program into the system? And the answer is usually it depends. And it's not necessarily something, you know, we can throw into the algorithm, which is, you know, it depends. So I think there is a lot of really fantastic frameworks that can be taken from the philosophy space. I think we still need to figure out how we're going to translate that into something that is going to come up with a decision on some of these issues when it comes down to it. Does the robot administer medication when no one's around, but the person's in pain, for example? The second part around, are we over considering ethics? When we think about the robotics discipline, a lot of the applications are for populations that are perhaps a little bit more sensitive in nature, very old people, very young people, perhaps people who can't easily consent for themselves. And while this is an area we believe robotics could support, it's also where ethical considerations needs to be at the forefront. How can we ensure that we're designing consent processes, that we're not recruiting participants that don't feel like they can easily say no because we're asking them to participate in robotic studies. So I think from that perspective, it's really important that we're considering our target populations. How can we give them the freedom and confidence and capability to choose not to engage with the systems if it's not something they choose to do? And we seem to focus less on the general public area, which I think is quite an interesting one. But to the meeting on the same page in engineers and philosophers, like, I would love to see some work in this space that shows how we can do that, because it would be such an amazing asset to have stronger guidance and not leave it up to people who aren't engaging with philosophers because they don't know how to translate it depends into actionable ways that the system can behave.
I think I'll break down your question into like two sections. The three questions into two sections. The first was the mad scientist, and then the second was the inclusion of philosophers within the process. So again, personal perspective, but I believe the mad scientist archetype will never die. You will always have creatives who will just create, regardless of any type of oversight. And I think this is the interesting thing, because it sounds like the question is, well, shouldn't there be some type of oversight? Shouldn't there be some type of regulation? I think that this is why I personally take the standpoint and encourage everyone I come by to understand their own individual moral value. Because at the end of the day, if that is at the forefront of you as an individual, it will funnel into whatever you're creating, regardless of what education you've had, regardless of what you've been told. I think that in an ideal world, everyone will follow something that they've been told and follow the regulations and will consider and be as mindful and empathetic of everyone around them. But I think if we're talking in a very pragmatic sense, that is not always the creative process. So that's kind of one standpoint. It maybe isn't a great answer, but it's one standpoint. The other side of that is inclusion of philosophers into the ethics process, whether that can look like a panel of philosophers in every school or whatnot. I think the issue that comes up, and this is an issue that we already face within ethics panels in universities, is domain knowledge, right? We're at the forefront of innovative technology. If a person doesn't fully understand everything about a project, how are they going to be able to give you some type of genuine and honest consideration? I have seen this time and time again in doing ethics applications on quite complex systems, none that I'm still working on at the moment, but previous ones where, you know, we were taking data of people's faces, we were recording what they were saying. These were in like sensitive settings, like a hospital environment, in an international airport environment. Like security was at the forefront of what we were doing. And the questions and considerations being discussed by ethics panels, clearly, it was clear that there wasn't an honest understanding of the complexity of the domain, right? And my fear would be if we pushed this line of, well, we need to be integrating these teams, we need to be integrating this type of oversight, is that it maybe won't make a difference. Maybe there won't be that output because these people might not have the flexibility of knowledge to be able to apply anything of value. I don't know if this is the case, but I fear maybe this is a situation that came up when you had a lot of big tech go on the phase of introducing ethics boards and panels within their teams and, you know, very quickly within a year or two just phase them out. So I don't know what the answer is. I think with a philosophical angle, it's important to be thinking about these things and having people in the room and having discussions, but oversight from a philosophical standpoint that isn't domain sensitive feels just like an additional administrative point. Yeah.
And then possibly we can conclude with you.
Okay, I'll try. This is very good then. All right, so actually I agree with everything that's been said right now. And what you're saying regarding the mad scientists and that entire approach, the reason why that's obviously always going to exist and it's never going to die out. Anyone who goes down a route of a PhD is already off kilter slightly, so they have some level of madness in them to be doing that. Any kind of research, you're already putting that kind of dedication in it. But to take it that far, the reason why that only happened before is because there was very loose understandings of ethics, which only now are becoming a bit more understood, a bit more fleshed out. But also the notion of ethics is a human-made construct itself, and tying it with the philosophy concept, with the question that you had, philosophers are stubborn. We just put it straight at that, and that's often the reason why it's very difficult to have them as part of our transdisciplinary approaches. It's not like you don't have them; you definitely do. Graham Harman, who I had his book up and on the slides as well, is probably one of the black cats that are considered in philosophy, where he's willing to make these obscure sort of philosophies and challenge other philosophies, which is often why he's considered as a controversial philosopher as well. And that's the main reason why you often may not see a lot of engagement with philosophers within these spaces, and they're often in their own bubbles for their own specific reason. I would love to have an actual philosopher, explain to me things that I'm trying to understand myself by not being a philosopher. I'd love to have that engagement, and I hope that at some point through this transdisciplinary approach with other departments, we can actually get these conversations happening. And actually understand what is the ethics of technologies that we engage with, the processes that we have in place, ethical applications that we have to put in for any kind of research. Those are all relying on constructs that have been established by humans for humans, but when we're dealing with technology that is not human or pretending to be human because it's AI, it's built off of models that humans have put forward, there are new paradigms that we have to understand. Philosophies need to probably be developed further for new kinds of ethics. And I think it's just, these are, again, conversations that need to happen. And having the ability to do that is essentially what we just need to tap into. If we have people from the philosophies department, even here at the UNSW, if they are interested in these things, I'd love to engage with them. I've got a list full of things I want to talk about when it comes to philosophy and technology, and there's lots of other possibilities that can emerge. New ethics can essentially come out, new disciplines can emerge from that then as well.
Wonderful. I guess that will be a perfect closing of our event. We have an unusual, diverse panel that I'm very proud that we were lucky and make it possible. And thank you so much for attending the event. I think it was a great gathering. So I invite you to continue the conversation after this. I guess there is still cold pizza outside. So thank you again, and see you next time.
Let's just thank Eduardo as well for putting all of the work in to get this together. Thanks.